Hey guys, tonight we slip into the dry wind of the Judean hills where the stones remember more than they're willing to say. The sun has long melted behind those bronze ridges, and you stand there squinting at a landscape that seems to hum with stories older than the alphabet. Sheep trails cut across the hillsides, the air smells faintly of thyme and dust, and somewhere maybe a shepherd's song once floated through this same valley. You probably won't survive this well, not the mosquitoes anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this little campfire of curiosity reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start walking downhill toward a dried wadi, shimmering in the moonlight. There's no sign, no ruin, no monument. Just earth that's been trampled by 100 generations. Somewhere around here, the stories say a boy named David watched his father's flocks. Maybe he slung stones at wolves. Maybe he practiced speeches to himself, rehearsing what he'd one day tell kings. Or maybe, if the scholars who love to spoil a good bedtime story are right, he never stood here at all. Historians still argue whether David was a real ruler or a literary invention stitched together centuries later. The Bible paints him in widescreen epic, a poet warrior who danced before the ark, united tribes, built an empire, and wrote songs to God. But archaeology, it's like trying to tune an old radio. You catch static fragments, and maybe, just maybe, a few words that sound like House of David before the signal dies again. You kneel to touch the ground. The soil here hides Bronze Age pottery, Iron Age arrowheads, and bits of bone blackened by ancient cooking fires. Each layer is a quiet paragraph in a story that nobody fully remembers how to read. Excavators have found sheepfold storage pits and olive presses, ordinary things. Yet every ordinary thing is a clue. The shepherd boy who became king had to begin somewhere. And this hill country, humble and harsh, fits the bill. The mainstream fact is that by the late 11th century BCE, small tribal groups really did dot this landscape. Archaeological surveys across Judah show clusters of modest villages, each maybe 20-30 families strong. They built in stone, stored grain in clay jars, and lived under a shared sense of kinship and covenant. That's the soil where a legend could sprout. And here's a quirky tidbit for your mental scrapbook researchers. Once uncovered a stash of ancient slingshots near the valley of Elah, smooth river stones still marked by the polish of flight. Were they the ammunition of shepherds or soldiers? Hard to say, but you can almost picture a young David sizing one up, whistling, and thinking, yeah, this'll do. You follow the valley's line until it opens into farmland. Fireflies blink in and out like soft applause. The quiet feels sacred, but your mind's already buzzing with contradictions. The Bible speaks of David as a national founder, yet no grand palace, no monumental inscription, no golden crown has turned up with his name on it. It's like chasing a shadow that refuses to hold still. Some scholars suggest that early Israelite stories were oral patchworks, folk memories of local heroes who later merged into the single glittering myth of David. You can almost hear that process happening, a song sung at a fire in one valley, a boast in another, gradually weaving into something eternal. Then again, other archaeologists point out that political memory often outlives physical ruins. Nomadic societies don't leave marble columns, they leave songs. Maybe David's truest monument was linguistic, the Psalms, the idioms, even the Hebrew name Dod, beloved, which still hums in the language like an echo of his legend. You kick a pebble and watch it roll down a slope glittering with quartz. The moon catches it, and for a heartbeat, it looks like a sling stone arcing through the dark before it vanishes into silence. The night wind sighs through the brush, whispering nothing stays buried forever. In the faint distance, lights shimmer, modern Jerusalem sitting atop layer after layer of vanished lives. Somewhere beneath that city's paving stones lies the next clue in your journey, a fragment of basalt that changed everything. But for now, you sit back on a warm boulder, let the night breathe around you, and wonder how much of history is real and how much is just beautifully told. You wake to the smell of dust and diesel, the morning sun already hammering the hills of northern Israel. The bus you rode through the night wheezes to a stop near Tel Dan, a lush oasis fed by one of the Jordan's headwaters. Birds chatter over the rumble of generators. Archaeologists in wide-brimmed hats are already at work, their trowels flicking through soil like careful punctuation marks. Somewhere among the pits and tents lies one of the most tantalizing fragments ever pulled from the earth, a shattered black basalt stele that might, depending on who you ask, prove that David actually lived. The Tel Dan stele doesn't look like much, just a few broken slabs covered in Aramaic script carved by a Syrian king around the 9th century BCE. But they're scratched in hard stone are the words that have stirred decades of late-night arguments by TDWD, House of David. You crouch beside a photo of the fragment pinned to a dig tent. The letters are uneven, like the hand that carved them was in a hurry or maybe nervous. The mainstream fact is simple enough. This inscription discovered in the 1990s is the first non-biblical reference to David found in the ancient Near East. It describes a victory over a Judean king from the House of David. If that's what it really says, it's monumental proof that an actual dynasty bore that name only a century after the supposed Davidic reign. But historians still argue whether those letters mean what believers want them to mean. Some claim the text could be read differently, House of Dodd, House of Uncle, or even a place name entirely unrelated to David. Others insist the phrase is unmistakable. In archaeology, 3 consonants can spark 1,000 dissertations. You kneel in the loose gravel where the stele was found. The wind hums through eucalyptus trees, and you can almost imagine the Aramean soldiers who once passed through here dusty and proud, setting up their monument to victory. They couldn't have known that one cracked stone would outlive their whole empire. There's something wonderfully ironic about it. A pagan inscription celebrating a foreign king's triumph, becoming the strongest evidence for Israel's most beloved ruler. You chuckle quietly. History has a wicked sense of humor. A young archaeologist brushes past holding a clipboard and a half-empty coffee cup. You can't believe how often we argue about that one, she says, nodding toward the exhibit tent. People come hoping to find David's autograph. Instead, they get 3 consonants and a migraine. You grin. So, no chance of finding his selfie carved on the other side. She snorts. If we did, we'd never tell Twitter. As she moves on, you step closer to the display case inside the visitor center. The basalt glints faintly under museum lighting. You can see the faint etching, the chipped edge where time chewed the story away. The room feels strangely reverent, like a chapel of uncertainty. Quirky tidbit time: when the stele was first unearthed, it was being reused as a building block in a later wall. Someone centuries after its creation had smashed it and stuck it in a fortification. That's archaeology for you, history recycling itself like bad fan fiction. You run your fingers over a replica, feeling the cool grit of carved stone. Maybe the words are authentic, maybe not. Either way, the idea of a House of David now exists in the real physical world. It's not just parchment and prayer anymore, it's basalt and dust. A breeze flutters through the open tent, carrying the scent of soil and sunscreen. You close your eyes and imagine the time gap collapsing, a 9th century scribe chiseling his boast, a modern researcher deciphering it under fluorescent light. 2 hands separated by millennia meeting across a single word. Still, the evidence is maddeningly partial. Archaeology rarely deals in certainties. It's a profession built on absences, on gaps you can't quite fill. That's what makes the Tel Dan stele both beautiful and frustrating. It says just enough to make you believe, and not enough to make you sure. In the late afternoon, you sit on a rock overlooking the dig. The Dan River sparkles through fig trees. Cicadas buzz like tiny electric wires. You think about how much faith, religious or scholarly, can hinge on such fragile things. One carved phrase, one disputed translation, and suddenly the line between scripture and science wobbles like heat on the horizon. Historians still argue whether the stele proves a dynasty, hints at a legend, or merely reflects later propaganda. But for you kneeling there with the dirt still clinging to your knees, the power of the story lies not in proof, but in pursuit. As the sun dips low, you trace those ghostly letters once more. House of David. 3 syllables, 3,000 years of longing. Whether it's history or poetry, you realize maybe the difference doesn't matter as much as we think. The echo of a shepherd king still hums in this soil, whether he was flesh and blood or simply an idea too human to fade. You rise, stretch, and glance toward the south. Jerusalem waits beyond those hills, dusty, ancient, and impatient for your next question. You shoulder your bag and start walking. The road south feels endless, mile after mile of stone terraces and olive groves shimmering under a heat haze. You pass shepherds with plastic water bottles tied to their belts, their flocks padding through the same dust that once swallowed the sandals of kings. By noon, you reach Jerusalem, not the glittering modern one humming with tour buses and neon hummus signs, but the hidden one buried deep beneath the asphalt, the city of David. You descend through a narrow metal staircase into the dig site. The air cools as you go down, down, until the noise of the city fades, and only the echo of your own breath remains. The ground under your feet is laced with tunnels, ancient water shafts, and broken walls. A flashlight beam catches a pottery handle stamped with a faint rosette, the kind officials use to mark royal goods. You smile. A shepherd boy's grocery label, you whisper. Mainstream fact beneath Jerusalem's old city, archaeologists have uncovered a network of structures dating to the 10th century BCE, roughly the era the Bible attributes to David's reign. There's the stepped stone structure, a massive retaining wall clinging to the slope, and above it, another set of ruins dubbed the large stone structure. Together, they might have formed part of an ancient citadel, or, as skeptics like to say, just an impressive nobleman's house that got overhyped by biblical tourism boards. Historians still argue whether these ruins marked David's actual capital or a later expansion under Judah's kings. The soil layers are tricky. Pottery typology is like reading tree rings while blindfolded. You crouch beside a section of wall, running your hand along the rough limestone blocks. They're irregular but solid, each one telling a story of hands that built without machines, only muscle rope and stubbornness. You close your eyes and try to picture it, the fortress of Zion, before it became Jerusalem, its wooden gates groaning, soldiers leaning on spears, children running through alleys of limestone dust. Maybe David's sandals scuffed this very threshold, or maybe centuries later, another king's boots did. Either way, this place feels thick with possibility. Then a volunteer guide strolls by, cheerful and sunburnt. "Want to see the water shaft?" she asks. You follow her through a cramped tunnel, slick with condensation. Your shoes squelch in the mud, and you duck beneath jagged stone until you emerge beside a narrow channel where water still trickles from the Gihon spring. This might be how the Israelites snuck into the Jebusite city, she says. Or maybe not. Depends which archaeologist you ask. You laugh softly. So basically, everything here is a maybe. Welcome to Biblical Archaeology, she grins. Our favorite word is possibly. You trace your finger along the damp wall. The rock is veined with mineral streaks that shimmer like ghostly fingerprints. The story goes that David's men climbed this shaft to capture Jerusalem, a clever sneak attack through the city's water system. It's cinematic, almost too cinematic. And that's exactly why scholars are divided. Was it history or heroic poetry polished over generations? A quirky tidbit: when early explorers first rediscovered this tunnel in the 19th century, they celebrated by crawling through it in tuxedos, lanterns in hand, singing hymns to David's mighty men. Victorian archaeologists really knew how to mix science with showmanship. You step out into daylight again, blinking. The city stretches upward, layers of time stacked like lasagna. Above you, modern apartment balconies. Below you, Iron Age ruins. Between them, the fragile thread of memory. A gust of wind carries the smell of street food, falafel, diesel, pomegranate juice, and for a moment the ancient and the modern blur. You imagine David wandering here as a newly crowned king, stunned by the noise, the pressure, the sudden responsibility. He didn't inherit an empire. He built one brick by brick, dream by dream. Still, the evidence is thin. No inscription reads David slept here. No royal seal bears his name. What we have are absences filled with faith and ruins filled with guesses. Yet standing here, those guesses feel alive. The silence around the stones hums with potential, as if the city itself refuses to stop telling its story, even if the words have worn away. As twilight rolls in, the stones turn gold, catching the last breath of sun. You sit at the edge of the excavation pit and listen to Jerusalem's heartbeat, distant traffic, the muezzin's call, church bells, laughter. Everything layered, everything arguing, just like the historians above and below ground. You whisper to the air, half joking, half reverent. If you're real, David, you've got one heck of a PR department. Somewhere, a stray cat meows like it agrees, and with that, you climb back toward the light, your hands dusty, your head full of questions, the next mystery waiting just beyond the ridge, the palaces that refuse to stay still. The next morning, tastes of coffee grounds and sunlight. You're sitting on a folding chair at the edge of the City of David excavation, staring down at what some call the large stone structure. The name itself sounds deliberately vague, like the archaeologists couldn't decide whether they'd found a palace, a citadel, or a particularly confident staircase. But this rectangle of rubble has stirred arguments louder than a Jerusalem traffic jam. From up here, it looks like a jigsaw puzzle made of limestone blocks. The ruins tumble down the slope, part of them blending into the older stepstone structure below. Some scholars claim these two once formed a massive royal complex, King David's very palace. Others insist it's wishful thinking, a classic case of archaeology bending to Scripture's charisma. You tilt your head, trying to imagine marble columns, cedar beams from Lebanon, and courtyards alive with harp music. It's not easy. Right now, it just looks like a confused stack of rocks trying to remember what it used to be. Mainstream Fact Eilat Mazar, an Israeli archaeologist, announced in 2005 that she believed this site was King David's palace based on pottery dated to the 10th century BCE and its location just above the ancient city walls. Her claim sent shockwaves through the academic world, some praising her boldness, others accusing her of biblical bias. Historians still argue whether Mazar was right or just brilliantly provocative. You step closer, sunlight sliding across the stones. The air smells of plaster dust and iron tools. Workers kneel with brushes, scraping millimeters of soil away as if diffusing a bomb. One of them points out a pottery fragment painted in faint geometric bands. You nod like you know what that means, though it mostly looks like a broken teacup. 10th century, he says proudly. Or 9th. Depends who you ask. You smile so ancient enough to ruin a few friendships. He laughs. Exactly. You crouch, tracing the outline of a doorway that once opened into something. A throne room, a kitchen, a goat pen. Archaeology never tells you everything. It teases, it flirts, but it never commits. A quirky tidbit bubbles up during early digs here in the 1920s. Explorers thought they'd found King David's toilet. Turned out to be a wine press. Different kind of royal flush. The sun climbs higher. You retreat to the shade of an olive tree, drinking warm water from your bottle and letting the hum of the city wash over you. Somewhere a bus honks. A muezzin calls the noon prayer. A guide's megaphone crackles with the words, "David's palace, possibly." You close your eyes and drift for a moment, letting the centuries rearrange themselves. You imagine cedar beams overhead, cool shade servants scurrying with bread and figs. Maybe a young musician plucking at a lyre. Maybe David himself, half general, half poet, leaning against a column watching the city he'd conquered shimmer in the sun. He must have felt both proud and terrified. Every new king does. The modern world fades until all you hear is the faint rustle of wind and the whisper of sandals in dust. Then, like a mirage, the palace dissolves back into rubble. The dream slips through your fingers, leaving only limestone dust under your nails. That's the cruel charm of this discipline. You spend your life chasing ghosts through dirt. And sometimes the ghosts win. Still, even if it isn't David's palace, this structure tells you something true. It proves Jerusalem was more than a village by the 10th century BCE. It was a hub, organized, fortified, alive with construction. That alone bridges a gap between the poetry of the Bible and the pragmatism of the trowel. Something powerful was happening here. Maybe not a vast empire, but a heartbeat strong enough to echo across ages. You jot a note in your travel journal. Palaces are like memories. They crumble differently depending on who's looking. It sounds profound now, but you'll probably cringe at it later. The afternoon fades and golden light pours across the stones. The workers pack up, covering the ruins with tarps to protect them from weather and from pigeons who, for reasons known only to pigeons, love defiling sacred history. As you climb back toward the road, the city hums around you, school kids shouting bells, ringing, the smell of shawarma curling through the air. The past and present never really separate here, they just overlap like half-erased chalk lines. You pause at the top of the hill, looking down one last time. The tarps ripple like sails in the breeze. You can't see a palace anymore, just shadows and potential. But that's enough. You smile and whisper, "Nice place, Dave. Shame about the rent." And as the wind carries your joke into the canyon, the next mystery tugs at your sleeve. The one box no archaeologist has managed to open the ark itself. You leave Jerusalem's stone stairways behind and follow the road north, tracing the ghostly path of the Ark of the Covenant, the most famous missing artifact in history, and easily the most argued about crate that never seems to stay put. The hills roll past like waves of ochre and shadow, and with each curve you can almost hear the echo of trumpets and the rustle of priests' robes. The air smells faintly of wild mint and diesel fumes. You pass Shiloh, first a quiet ruin of tumbled stones surrounded by vineyards. According to Scripture, this was where the ark once rested before David ever slung a stone or strummed a harp. Archaeologists have found traces of Iron Age worship here, animal bones, shattered pottery, even what might be the foundations of a rectangular shrine. Mainstream fact these ruins do date to the period described in the Book of Samuel. But whether they house the ark or just a local cult center, historians still argue whether any single artifact here connects to Israel's sacred chest, or if that's just wishful storytelling projected backward through faith. You wander through the ruins as cicadas buzz loud enough to drown thought. A tour group murmurs nearby their guide, gesturing dramatically toward a raised platform. Here, he declares, stood the tabernacle of God. You can't help smiling. It's a great line, but like all great lines, it's unprovable. A quirky tidbit: one archaeologist in the 1980s claimed to have found burn marks from the ark's holiness on stones here. Turns out they were just campfire soot. Divine or not, it seems even holiness burns like charcoal. From Shiloh, your path follows the old caravan routes toward Kiriath Jearim, the ark's supposed halfway house before David hauled it to Jerusalem. The road is steep, the sun unrelenting. You imagine the priest stumbling under the ark's weight. Acacia wood and gold aren't exactly lightweight travel materials. The Bible says one poor man named Uzzah reached out to steady it and was struck dead on the spot. Harsh cosmic customer service, but it gives a sense of the reverence this object inspired. At Kiriath Jearim, a monastery crowns the hill, its garden neat and fragrant with rosemary. Beneath it lie ruins that archaeologists recently re-examined. What they found surprised them: massive walls, storage rooms, and fortifications dating to the same century as David's rise. Could this have been a sanctuary or even an administrative outpost tied to Jerusalem? Some scholars think so. Others shrug. The stones, as usual, plead the fifth. You sit under a fig tree watching the horizon shimmer. It's strange to think how one gilded box, half temple relic, half political trophy, could shape so much theology and so many treasure hunter fantasies. Indiana Jones made it a pop icon, but ancient Israel made it a heartbeat of identity. As twilight deepens, you retrace David's imagined route down toward Jerusalem's valleys. Picture the procession priests blowing ram's horns, dancers whirling, David himself leaping in ecstatic abandon before the ark. He wasn't exactly a dignified king that day. His wife Michal scolded him for making a spectacle. You can't help but grin. Every age has its viral moment. Then, of course, the ark vanished from history. Some say hidden before the Babylonian conquest, others whispering it was smuggled to Egypt or Ethiopia. One modern Ethiopian church even claims to keep it locked away, guarded by a single monk who never leaves his post. True or not, that detail feels poetic, a living metaphor for faith itself, unseen, guarded, and burning too brightly to touch. You lean back against the fig tree, the sky going lavender above. Crickets start their nightly orchestra. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the desert wind slides over the ruins of Shiloh, over the hidden tunnels of Jerusalem, carrying the same dust that once settled on the ark's golden lid. Archaeologists have searched for centuries and found nothing definitive. Not a hinge, not a handle, not a single gilded splinter. Yet the absence feels loud, doesn't it? The silence hums like something withheld on purpose. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the ark's greatest power wasn't its gold, but its ability to make people look for it forever. Historians still argue whether the ark was a real cult object or a symbolic story crafted to explain Israel's identity in exile. But as you sit in the half-dark fireflies winking in the valley, you realize something comforting in the uncertainty. Whether buried in a cave or lost in legend, the ark endures just invisible enough to keep wonder alive. You stretch dust off your jeans and glance south. Tomorrow's path leads back toward David's expanding realm, where script and soil collide over questions of empire armies and the weight of evidence. For now, though, you let the evening hush lull you. Somewhere in that hush, the faintest sound of drums drifts from memory, as if the ark's procession still marches beneath the stars. The next day begins with a soft dawn over the Judean highlands, pale light spilling through olive branches like thin sheets of gold. You're back in the hills again, notebook in hand, ready to test the grandest question of them all. Was David's kingdom The sprawling empire Scripture describes, or something smaller, humbler, and a bit less cinematic. You trudge along a trail that snakes above the valley of Elah, the legendary site of David's showdown with Goliath. Below the plain stretches wide and quiet, dotted with red anemones. You half expect to hear a giant's roar echoing from the ridges, but only the wind answers. The Bible claims that after that famous duel, David's realm ballooned into a powerful monarchy, stretching from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt. It's an image of grandeur armies tribute cedar palaces the works, but the spade has been less flattering. Archaeologists have unearthed only modest settlements, from the period small clusters of houses surrounded by low defensive walls. Historians still argue whether the so-called United Monarchy was truly an empire or simply an alliance of mountain villages with an especially poetic PR department. You stop at Khirbet Qeiyafa, a site perched above the valley. This is where, in the early 2000s, excavators found a fortified town dating to around 1000 BCE, the very century of David. The mainstream fact, the town's double walls and city gate were surprisingly sophisticated, suggesting an organized polity. Some scholars think it was part of Judah's early statehood. Others think it was a Canaanite or Philistine border outpost. No one agrees naturally. You crouch near one of the exposed gates. A signboard reads Shah Arayim, possibly the biblical two-gated city. Possibly. The word again. It's archaeology's equivalent of a shrug. Still, you can't help admiring how solid the stones are, each block fitting into the next with stubborn precision. Whoever built this wanted permanence, not poetry. A breeze brushes the dust off your shoes as you walk the perimeter. You imagine life here 3 millennia ago. Black smoke fires, shepherds driving goats through narrow alleys, women grinding grain, soldiers gossiping about the latest border raid. It's not glamorous, but it's human. And if David truly ruled over places like this, maybe his greatness wasn't in scale, but in uniting so many small hopes under one fragile banner. A quirky tidbit drifts up from your reading. Some early archaeologists tried to estimate David's army size by counting sling stones found in the region. They came up with roughly 500 per site and concluded he must have commanded a modest but efficient militia, which is a scholarly way of saying he had good aim, but not many friends. You smile. A lean kingdom, you murmur with strong wrists. Looking out over the valley, the modern farmland mirrors the ancient patchwork of fields that sustained early Judah. The pattern feels eternal soil tilled, harvested, abandoned, reclaimed. You kick a clump of earth and think of all the empires that promised eternity yet vanished faster than a footprint after rain. Maybe David's empire endures precisely because it lived in words, not walls. Still, part of you wishes for one big shiny piece of evidence, a plaque saying, "Welcome to David's kingdom. Population ambitious." But history doesn't gift wrap proof. It whispers hints. You stop by a shaded dig tent where a grad student is cataloging pottery. So, you ask, is this really from David's time? He shrugs. Probably. Depends who you ask. You grin. Let me guess, there's a debate. There's always a debate. He shows you a potsherd etched with faint letters, Proto-Canaanite script, maybe the earliest form of Hebrew. It's part of the reason people think Qeiyafa could have been Judean. The text might reference social justice or divine judgment, depending on translation. Justice and judgment, you say. Sounds like David's playlist. He chuckles. Exactly. When you climb back up the ridge, the wind picks up, fluttering the tarps below like sails. The landscape unfurls in every direction. Bethlehem's hills to the east, Philistia's flatlands to the west. You realize how precarious this kingdom would have been, one ambitious ruler wedged between superpowers like Egypt and Damascus. Maybe that's why the biblical authors wrote his story as both triumph and caution. Historians still argue whether David's Jerusalem was a true capital or just an administrative hilltop. The pottery says one thing, the text another. And somewhere between them lies a truth you can feel but not measure, a truth that smells of dust oil, lamps, and ambition. As the sun slides low, the valley glows copper. You can almost hear a lyre string plucked in the distance, a melody, half memory, half mirage. The so-called empire may never have stretched to Egypt, but its songs did, echoing through centuries, sung by exiles, monks, and modern pilgrims with Bluetooth speakers. You jot one last line in your journal. The shovel contradicts the scripture, yet both describe the same hunger to be remembered. Then you close the notebook and sling your bag over your shoulder. The trail ahead leads deeper into copper country, where mines and metalwork tell their own version of power, a kingdom not carved in stone, but forged in fire. The desert air turns metallic before you even reach it, the faint tang of copper dust carried on a wind that hums like a forge. You've left the green hills behind and stepped into the reddish world of Timnah, the ancient copper mines of the Arabah Valley. The horizon ripples in heat waves, sandstone cliffs glow like frozen fire. It's hard to believe that 3,000 years ago this was one of the industrial hearts of the Levant. You duck under a shade tarp where archaeologists are sorting slag lumps of glassy black residue from ancient smelting furnaces. It's not exactly the kind of treasure Hollywood promised, but here buried in ash lies a clue that could redraw the map of David's supposed kingdom. Mainstream fact, during the 10th century BCE, Timnah and the neighboring region of Edom were bustling copper production zones. Excavations have uncovered thousands of furnaces, ore processing pits, and donkey pens for hauling supplies. Radiocarbon dating shocked everyone. It showed an organized, technologically advanced society existed here, right when the Bible says David and Solomon ruled. You run your fingers across a chunk of slag. It's still rough, gritty, scarred by the fire that once melted rock into metal. The researchers here call this stuff the archaeology of smoke. Through chemical analysis, they can even tell how hot the furnaces burned and what fuel they used: charcoal from local acacia wood burned by slaves workers or nomads who may not have known they were part of an empire's pulse. Historians still argue whether these mining operations were under the control of Israel's kings or independent Edomite chiefs. The Bible claims David subdued Edom garrison troops here and seized its wealth. But the evidence cuts both ways. Some signs suggest local autonomy, others hint at foreign administration. The desert, as usual, keeps its secrets under several feet of politely silent sand. A gust whips grit against your face. You squint through the heat, imagining the copper caravans crawling north toward Jerusalem, mules laden with ingots, guards fanning away flies, merchants haggling under canvas tents. That copper could have become shield statues, or maybe even temple fittings. It's a long way from the shepherd's sling to the logistics of empire, but maybe this is what David's reign really looked like: less throne room, more supply chain. A quirky tidbit: when archaeologists analyzed donkey dung from Timnah, they discovered traces of hay imported from hundreds of kilometers away. That means trade networks stretched across borders long before Israel became a regional power. Ancient globalization powered by donkeys. You grin at the thought: a Bronze Age FedEx service, complete with braying complaints. Nearby, a student waves you over to a tent filled with labeled bags of charcoal. "You see these," she says, pointing to a line of samples. "They're dated to the 10th century BCE. This shows continuous large-scale production. Whoever ran this place knew what they were doing." "So you're saying these mines could have funded David's wars or Solomon's temples," you ask. "Could have," she says carefully, "or maybe they funded someone else's." The word maybe again. You've learned to love it. It's the archaeologist's version of faith. You walk out past the dig zone and into the Timnah Valley proper. The formations around you look almost alive. Red pillars, mushroom-shaped rocks, streaks of black manganese swirling through sandstone. One cliff is called Solomon's Pillars, though that's more poetic branding than proof. Still standing beneath them, it's easy to imagine the rhythmic clang of hammers, the rush of bellows, the glow of molten ore at twilight. Copper isn't just metal, it's memory. Each ingot carried energy, organization, and hierarchy. To run a mine like this, someone had to plan labor shifts, manage food, secure routes, negotiate trade. That someone many believe could have been the early Judean monarchy. If true, David's realm wasn't built on mythic miracles, but on very practical metallurgy. The heat deepens into afternoon. You find a sliver of shade under a cliff, shaped like a wave about to break. The silence here is heavy but not empty. It vibrates with the echo of effort of generations who worked and sweated and believed. You imagine a young overseer counting ore by lamplight, muttering curses at lazy workers, perhaps scribbling notes in Proto-Hebrew on a potsherd. That's the real kingdom: tired hands, glowing furnaces, copper gleaming like sunset in a crucible. Historians still argue whether this industrial network truly connected back to Jerusalem or just inspired the later biblical writers to imagine such a connection. But you realize something. As the light shifts on the cliffs, truth in archaeology isn't binary. It's layered like the earth itself. Each interpretation is a stratum. Each discovery reshapes the past just a little the way molten copper changes shape as it cools. The day ends in fire. The entire valley turns crimson as the sun slips behind the Edomite hills. You pick up a small piece of greenish malachite, a copper ore, and tuck it in your pocket, your own fragment of the argument. As the sky darkens, a warm wind slides through the canyon, and you swear it carries a low metallic hum. Maybe it's just your imagination, or maybe in the heart of Timnah, the ancient furnaces still remember the rhythm of David's drums. Night falls over the highlands as you head back toward the ridges above Jerusalem, and you can feel the weight of politics pressing through the centuries. You've seen shepherd stones, fortress ruins, and copper slag, but now comes the real battlefield. Not swords and chariots, but memory versus evidence. The kingdom that Scripture paints in gold leaf has left only faint fingerprints, and each new discovery seems to redraw David's silhouette. You pass through the gate of Khirbet Qeiyafa again, that twin-gated fortress you visited earlier, now quieter in the late evening. Flashlights flicker across trench walls where pottery shards gleam like fallen stars. You overhear a team debating over dinner. Centralized administration, one insists stabbing at his pita for emphasis. This site proves it. Another shakes her head. Or maybe it was just a fortified border town. A regional chief could have built this without any David. Historians still argue whether Khirbet Qeiyafa marks the emergence of a united monarchy or simply a patchwork of rival tribes coexisting with a shared style of pottery. The line between empire and organized neighborhood can be thinner than a potsherd's edge. You find a seat on a low wall, breathing in the cool dust and the faint tang of time that grows wild around the ruins. Stars blink awake, and for a moment the landscape feels suspended between myth and data. Somewhere in that space sits David, a figure too big for his century, too small for his legend. Mainstream fact, archaeological surveys show a cluster of fortified settlements across Judah from around 1000 BCE. Places like Beth Shemesh Lachish and Tel Moza show growing complexity walls, administrative buildings, even planned layouts. It's the archaeological signature of statehood. But here's the twist, none of them have inscriptions naming David or any house of David. The stones are eloquent but anonymous. A quirky tidbit: when the Tel Moza temple was uncovered, just a few kilometers from Jerusalem, it looked eerily like Solomon's temple as described in the Bible. Same layout, same cultic features, just smaller. Some scholars now joke that Solomon's temple might have just been Moza 2.0, the deluxe sequel. You can't help chuckling at that one. Turns out divine architecture may have had a prototype phase. As the night deepens, you walk down toward the valley, where the faint lights of modern Jerusalem shimmer. Beneath those lights lies layer after layer of destruction and rebuilding. Babylonian fires, Persian streets, Hellenistic sewers, Roman pavements, Crusader vaults. Somewhere below it all might be traces of David's city, buried like a rumor that refuses to die. You stop near an excavation pit lit by a generator's harsh white glow. Inside, a young archaeologist crouches over a trowel, brushing dust off a faint line of stones. Wall, someone asks. She shrugs. Could be a wall, could be a foundation, could be my imagination. You grin. At least she's honest. Down the slope lies the most controversial site of all the City of David excavation. You descend the path until the air turns damp and echoes bounce through tunnels carved into limestone. The Gihon Spring trickles somewhere below the same water source that sustained Jerusalem in David's day. Some believe his men entered the city through this tunnel to conquer it from the Jebusites, a stealthy Iron Age special ops mission. Others say the story was written centuries later to give David's victory a cinematic flair. Mainstream fact: the Warren's shaft system and nearby fortifications are real and ancient. They show engineering skill that fits the biblical timeline, but scholars can't prove who built them. It's one of those puzzles that refuses to land, half historical thriller, half ghost story. As you pass a sign warning "Watch your head," you duck into a tunnel so narrow that your shoulders brush both sides. The stone feels cold, damp, ageless. For a second, the only sound is your breathing and the slow drip of water echoing from somewhere ahead. You imagine the ancient workers chipping by torchlight, their sweat mixing with limestone dust. The pass feels so close you could almost reach through the centuries if only you knew what to grab. Back above ground, the modern city hums with traffic and neon. You stand where the ridge drops off toward the Kidron Valley and look east. Moonlight gleams on olive leaves, and the walls of the old city glow like pale parchment. Somewhere in this panorama lies the truth about David's capital, but you realize how fragile truth becomes when filtered through devotion, translation, and time. Historians still argue whether David was a tribal warlord elevated by later authors into a messianic prototype or a real monarch who simply left too little behind. The evidence leans both ways like a balancing scale. Archaeology gives you the stones, Scripture gives you the story, and between them yawns the shadow where faith and skepticism shake hands awkwardly. You breathe in the scent of dust diesel and incense drifting from a nearby church. Maybe that's the best way to understand the kingdom of David, not as an empire of conquest, but as a lingering vibration in stone and song. The archaeologists can measure copper map walls and date ash layers, but they can't carbon date belief. Above you, the first call to prayer floats from a distant minaret weaving through the bells of a nearby monastery. It's the sound of continuity. The city still alive, still contested, still sacred to everyone who claims it. And for a fleeting second, you think maybe that's David's real legacy. Not the throne, not the fortress, but the argument that never ends. Morning slips back across the hills like a soft tide gilding the limestone terraces and turning every olive leaf into a tiny mirror. You wake to the sound of bells and birds, the same duet that's likely rung here for 3,000 years. Today, your path leads not deeper underground, but outward to the scholars, skeptics, and dreamers, still fighting over what David's world truly looked like. Because at this point, the story isn't just buried in dirt, it's tangled in the politics of interpretation. You join an early breakfast at a cafe overlooking the old city. The table next to you hosts what looks like a low-key academic argument in progress. 3 archaeologists, 1 journalist, and a theologian who clearly didn't expect to referee. Minimalist versus maximalist, one of them says, waving her croissant like a trowel. Always the same fight. Mainstream fact, biblical archaeology has split into 2 major schools for decades. Maximalists believe that the Bible, while theological, preserves solid historical memory, meaning David and Solomon ruled an actual kingdom that archaeology will eventually prove. Minimalists, on the other hand, argue that those stories were composed centuries later, projecting national myth backward to legitimize a later regime. Both camps have their champions, their critics, and their coffee habits. A quirky tidbit, one scholar famously joked that you can tell which side someone's on by how they pronounce Jerusalem. If they say it with reverence, they're probably a maximalist. If they sigh, first minimalist. You almost choke on your hummus laughing. You finish breakfast and follow a group of students heading to the Hebrew University. Inside a seminar room cluttered with maps and pottery photos, a professor points at a slide showing 2 circles, the low chronology and the high chronology of Israel's Iron Age. Shift the dating by 50 years, he explains, and David's kingdom either exists or doesn't. You blink. 50 years, the difference between a nation and a neighborhood watch. Historians still argue whether radiocarbon dating from sites like Megiddo Gezer and Hazor supports the 10th century David-Solomon's era, or pushes all major construction to the 9th, when Omri and Ahab ruled the northern kingdom. The date is there, but like sand through fingers, it slides depending on assumptions. You sit in the back row, scribbling mental notes as the discussion spirals into controlled chaos, architecture styles, pottery sequences, ancient carbon decay rates. It's like watching a theological rock band debate tempo. One student finally mutters, "Can't we just ask David?" The professor smiles. "We've been trying for 3 millennia." When class ends, you wander to the rooftop terrace overlooking the Mount of Olives. The wind smells of sage and asphalt. You think about the archaeologists. You've met the ones who dig hoping to prove the Bible and the ones who dig hoping to disprove it. Yet both in their own way are drawn by the same mystery. You can't help but admire that symmetry. Below you, Jerusalem sprawls like a palimpsest, layered, rewritten, half erased, yet still legible in parts. Somewhere under the modern skyline lie the remains of that Iron Age village or proto-capital, the kernel around which legends grew like ivy. Maybe David was a charismatic clan leader who unified scattered tribes. Maybe he was a bard politician whose songs outlived his soldiers. Or maybe he was both a ruler who built as much from metaphor as from mortar. You stop by a museum later that afternoon, the air inside cool and slightly dusty. In a glass case rests a replica of the Tel Dan Stele, the very basalt slab that once changed everything. The Aramaic inscription glints under soft light, Beit David, the House of David. Just 2 words, yet they hit like a thunderclap when first discovered in 1993. It's the first and only ancient reference to David outside the Bible. Mainstream fact, the Tel Dan Stele, likely commissioned by an Aramean king around the 9th century BCE, boasts of defeating the king of Israel and the king of the house of David. It doesn't describe David himself. He'd been dead for a century, but it shows his name had become a dynastic term. Someone remembered him. Someone claimed descent. That's history enough to jolt the debate. Of course, not everyone agrees. A few fringe scholars argue the letters might be misread, that Beit David could mean something else entirely. One even suggested it referred to a god named Dod or Daudabi. Ugrin's scholarly creativity knows no bounds. Still, most experts accept the reading. It's modest, but it's evidence real chiseled and older than any sermon. Standing there, you feel a chill. Not because of the museum air conditioning, but because you're staring at something that bridges scripture and stone. You can almost hear the ancient scribe pressing the chisel into basalt, unaware he was carving the most contested name in biblical history. You linger until closing time, tracing your reflection over the glass. It's strange how 2 syllables can carry the weight of centuries. David, beloved, may be the most human of all biblical figures. Singer, slinger, sinner, sovereign. Whether he ruled empires or only imagination, his story became the heartbeat of identity for a people scattered across time. As the sun sets over the city, you walk toward the tram stop. Neon glows on old stones, and the muezzin's call mingles again with church bells. Somewhere behind those sounds, behind the clamor of buses and arguments, you sense a quieter rhythm, the pulse of evidence and faith dancing an uneasy waltz. And you realize something archaeology might never prove David. But maybe it doesn't need to. The stones speak softly, the songs echo louder, and between them, the man himself lingers half buried, half believed. You wake before dawn to a pale Jerusalem sky streaked with pink and gold, the kind of fragile morning that feels borrowed rather than owned. The bells haven't started yet, and the air holds that peculiar stillness that cities only manage before their first espresso. You slip on your jacket, sling your notebook under your arm, and head west out toward the valleys and ruins that whisper not of David's rise, but of the man who might have remembered him best, Solomon. The road to the Shephelah, the low hills, unfolds like a scroll written in dust. Every ridge carries traces of fortresses, granaries, and collapsed gates. If David was the sword, Solomon was the ledger. And while tonight's story is still about David's evidence, you can't separate father from son. One casts the other's shadow. Mainstream fact, the 10th century BCE, supposedly David and Solomon's era was a turning point in the southern Levant. Archaeologists see growth in monumental architecture, administrative seals and trade routes stretching to Phoenicia and Egypt. That doesn't mean every wall belongs to Solomon's building spree, but it hints at something stirring some shift from village to state, from legend to logistics. You climb the mound of Megiddo, next a site layered like a wedding cake baked by time itself. The wind smells of wild time and history. A tour guide ahead of you waves his arms toward the vast ruins. This, he declares proudly, was fortified by Solomon himself. You can almost hear the collective camera shutters clicking. You bite back a smile. It's a good story, one told for over a century. But archaeologists now debate whether those iconic Solomonic gates belong to his reign at all. Some date them 50 years later to the northern kings of Israel. Others hold their ground, no pun intended, insisting Solomon's masons built them first. Historians still argue whether the biblical Solomon's projects are royal propaganda or an echo of something real but smaller. You lean over the edge of the dig trench, looking at ash layers and walls that have seen more reinterpretations than a Marvel reboot. Yet something about their scale still hums with power. Massive ashlar stones, meticulous planning drain channels cut for permanence. You imagine teams of workers hauling limestone under the sun, overseen by scribes counting loads of timber from Lebanon. Maybe the Bible's poetic flourish wasn't exaggeration, it was admiration. A quirky tidbit: early explorers once mistook the site's stables for Solomon's chariot houses, proudly counting over 400 horse stalls. Later analysis showed they were actually storehouses, not garages, for divine horsepower. Still, the image of royal steeds lined up under this blazing sky refuses to leave your imagination. You step down into the famous water system, a tunnel that twists deep into the bedrock, cool and echoing. Drips fall rhythmically from the ceiling like a metronome of centuries. Here you can feel the genius of the builders, whoever they were. They understood defense, supply, and survival. That alone speaks of organization, and organization means leadership, whether named David Solomon or someone long forgotten. By midday, you're standing on the Tell's highest platform, the breeze tugging at your shirt. From here, the Jezreel Valley stretches green and endless. Armies once clashed here. Prophets once shouted visions into the wind. You picture David's descendants watching from these same ridges, measuring power in harvests and horsemen. Historians still argue whether David's realm was a small tribal kingdom inflated by later scribes or the early framework of a centralized state that inspired every later generation to mythologize it. The debate feels almost theological. What counts as real? Is it gold walls or the idea that someone dreamed big enough to build them? You find shade beneath a crumbling tower and take a slow drink of water. Somewhere nearby, a student team is measuring pottery rims, arguing over whether a cooking pot or a storage jar tells a better political story. You smile. It's archaeology's greatest irony: grand questions answered by the world's smallest fragments. As the sun dips low, you wander past olive groves and broken cisterns. Cicadas trill like old film static. Every ruin glows with that bittersweet twilight hue, the one that makes the past seem both close and unreachable. Maybe that's the whole charm of biblical archaeology. It's less about finding the truth and more about walking the edge between belief and bedrock. You can't carbon date a psalm, but you can trace its echo through valleys like this. You can feel it in the stones, the wells, the wind. You head back toward Jerusalem as the horizon turns molten red. The bus hums quietly, a lullaby of wheels and dust. Through the window, you see a shepherd guiding his flock down a slope, and for a second time folds David's silhouette, could be walking there, harp slung over his shoulder, humming some tune that would later become scripture. And you realize the evidence might never settle the argument, but the longing to know, to see the man behind the myth, that's its own kind of faith. The sort that keeps both archaeologists and dreamers returning to these same hills, trowels in hand, hearts half skeptical, half hopeful. As Jerusalem's lights flicker into view, the call to prayer drifts over the valleys again, mingling with the bells. You close your notebook and exhale, a soft smile forming. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be heard, one echo at a time. The next morning, Jerusalem feels different, quieter, slower, as if the city itself is pausing to catch its breath. You wander south along a dusty path that winds toward the ancient ridge once called the City of David. The air is cool, smelling faintly of limestone and morning bread from a nearby bakery. Pigeons flutter overhead, dislodging a few centuries' worth of dust from the walls. It's easy to forget how small the place really is, barely a few acres of hilltop real estate. And yet, from this narrow rise, the legend of a kingdom was launched that would ripple across continents and millennia. You reach the dig site's metal railing and look down at the so-called stepped stone structure, a massive terraced wall plunging into shadow. Some call it the Milo mentioned in the Bible as part of David's construction projects. Others call it a retaining wall or a defensive platform, or less romantically, a monumental pile of very stubborn rocks. Still, it's hard not to feel a thrill. The scale alone suggests something powerful happened here, something organized, deliberate. Mainstream fact radiocarbon analysis dates this structure roughly to the 10th century BCE, the era traditionally linked to David, and just above it sits the large stone structure, another set of walls some archaeologists have tentatively identified as a royal building, maybe even David's palace. Not a marble wonder, mind you, more like a sturdy rectangular complex of limestone blocks, storage rooms, and a commanding view of the valley below. You walk along the path overlooking the dig. A guide's voice echoes. This might be where King David looked out and saw Bathsheba bathing. The group gasps softly. Phones lift for pictures. You resist the urge to whisper, or it might just be where he paid taxes. Still, it's a good story. A quirky tidbit: when the large stone structure was first excavated in the early 2000s, a pottery fragment bearing a faint Hebrew inscription was found nearby. Some scholars thought it might belong to an administrative vessel used by the royal household. Others, perhaps tired of the hype, said it was probably from a neighbor's pantry jar. Archaeology, you think, is 90% patience and 10% polite disagreement. You trace your fingers over the stones, cool, ancient, dimpled by time. Whether or not they held a throne room, they certainly held lives, builders, guards, scribes, cooks, children. People who looked at the same hills you're looking at now may be wondering if the future would remember them. Historians still argue whether the city of David's grand features truly belonged to David's reign, or were later constructions rebranded by later authors to anchor their national myth. Some suggest the palace was built centuries afterward. Others insist it's exactly what the texts describe. What's striking is how the debate itself has become part of the site's identity, as if each theory adds a new invisible layer of architecture. You duck into the narrow tunnels below where trickling water echoes through Hezekiah's tunnel, a later construction, but one that follows the same spring that fed the city from the start. The air down here tastes metallic and ancient. The tunnel twists like a snake cut by chisels more than 2.5 millennia ago. You switch on your flashlight and follow the wavering beam along the damp walls, carved inscriptions marking the meeting point of two digging teams who somehow aligned perfectly underground. You whisper to yourself, faith meets engineering. That might as well be the slogan of this whole landscape. Back above ground, you find a ledge overlooking the Kidron Valley. Sunlight burns on the olive trees below the same groves where pilgrim soldiers and prophets once walked. You imagine David pacing here, worrying about alliances and enemies, maybe humming half a psalm before losing the tune. You can almost hear him muttering about supply lines while his harp leans forgotten in a corner. Because the more you learn, the more human he becomes. Not the marble hero, but the restless strategist, the flawed leader, the man who wanted to build something that lasted longer than his mistakes. Mainstream archaeology, for all its restraint, can't erase that pull. Even skeptics feel it, that gravitational tug of narrative, the sense that behind these ruins lies someone whose decisions shaped centuries of belief. You stay until the shadows lengthen. The city hums again, buses groaning uphill, kids laughing somewhere, a dog barking as the muezzin's call drifts across the valley. The echo bounces between walls that have seen empires rise and vanish. And right there, in that sound, you sense David's truest monument, not in the stones, but in the persistence of the argument, the retelling, the remembering. Historians still argue whether the real David is recoverable at all. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's half buried beneath layers of time and theology. But as the last sunlight catches the city's domes, you realize something else. Sometimes the evidence doesn't need to prove the legend. It just needs to keep the conversation alive. You pull your hood up against the chill and start the slow climb back toward the old city. Somewhere behind you, the city of David settles into twilight, its stones glowing faintly gold. Maybe the king once watched the same light fade and thought, this is enough. You wake to wind and gull cries drifting in from the west, carrying the salt breath of the Mediterranean. Today, you're leaving Jerusalem's hills for the coast, where David's story meets the sea and the stones whisper in different dialects. The bus hums along the highway through fields of wheat and citrus, and you think about how every road in Israel seems to pass over the ghosts of empires. Somewhere beneath the asphalt, Phoenician traders, Roman legions, and Crusader knights all left footprints that never fully fade. Your destination is Tel Kasil, an unassuming mound on the northern edge of modern Tel Aviv. It's the kind of site that rarely makes headlines, just a cluster of temples and storage rooms. But here, archaeologists found evidence of early Philistine settlements. And that, of course, loops you right back to David's most famous encounter, Goliath, the original underdog duel. Mainstream fact excavations at Philistine sites like Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gath reveal a sophisticated urbanized culture with advanced metalworking and imported pottery styles from the Aegean world. These weren't bumbling villains in bronze armor. They were Mediterranean migrants, cosmopolitan and proud. Their cities flourished along trade routes, their gods had names, and their soldiers wielded iron when Israel still fought with bronze. You walk among the low ruins, sunlight glinting off shards of pottery still half buried in the sand. It's strange to imagine that David's defining battle may have been less a mythic miracle and more a gritty clash of economic shepherd versus soldier, frontier tribe versus industrial city-state. You chuckle softly. Goliath had armor, you think. David had supply chain issues. A quirky tidbit at Tel Es Safi, identified as ancient Gath archaeologists, uncovered a pottery shard inscribed with the name Goliath, or rather a close linguistic cousin, Alot. It's not proof of the Goliath, but it shows the name was common in that region at that time. Historians still argue whether that counts as evidence, or just a delightful coincidence thrown at us by the universe's cheeky sense of humor. You crouch down beside one of the Philistine temples where columns of smooth stone once supported cedar beams. Nearby, they found a stash of small offering bowls filled with ash and animal bone ritual leftovers from a world that believed the gods loved barbecue. The wind sighs through the site, and for a moment, it feels like the hush after battle. You picture a young David approaching this kind of temple perhaps as an emissary or a conqueror. Would he have been awed by its sophistication or threatened by it? As the sun climbs higher, you follow the coastline south toward the ruins of Ashkelon. Waves crash hard against the seawalls, ancient stones patched and repatched through the ages. The scent of salt and thyme mingles with something older, like sun-baked clay. Here, archaeologists discovered vast storehouses, olive presses, and burial jars that once held infants. The latter find sparked fierce debate. Some thought it was evidence of ritual sacrifice. Others argued it was simply an early form of cemetery. The truth, like so many things in this landscape, remains half-buried. Historians still argue whether David's conquest of the Philistines was total or temporary. The Bible paints him as their conqueror, but the archaeological record shows Philistine culture thriving well into later centuries. Maybe David subdued them politically, but borrowed from them culturally military tactics, metallurgy, even musical instruments. After all, you can't build an empire on isolation. You borrow, adapt, remix. Like any good playlist, history loves a collaboration. You take a seat on the seawall, the Mediterranean glittering before you. The waves sound like applause, or maybe mockery, it's hard to tell which. Somewhere beneath your shoes, layers of ash and pottery tell a quieter story trade interrupted by war alliances shifting with the tide. Mainstream fact Philistine pottery eventually blends with local styles by the 9th century BCE, suggesting cultural fusion rather than annihilation. That's not so different from what you've seen everywhere else in this journey, the blur between mythic boundaries. The Israelites and Philistines weren't cosmic opposites. They were neighbors in tension, shaping each other's stories. You look west where the sea meets the haze and wonder how much of David's legend was written from hindsight, from a people looking back on centuries of rivalry and saying, "Once we beat the giants." Maybe the story's power isn't in its accuracy, but its aspiration the moment a shepherd dares to imagine victory against impossible odds. The tide laps closer, foaming around the base of the wall. You toss a pebble into the surf, watching it vanish without ceremony. The waves, like history, erase everything evenly, heroes and villains alike. You close your notebook and glance back toward the inland hills. Tomorrow, you'll return east again, toward the borderlands where David's empire supposedly stretched. But for now, the sea hums like a memory you can't quite place. The wind tastes of salt and bronze. You can almost hear distant harp strings tangled in the crash of waves, music rising over the sound of marching feet. Maybe that's the truest thing about all this evidence. Or not, his song still echoes. The next morning, you trade the salt air for heat, the inland road unspooling through dry plains and wadi sunlight so sharp it seems to hum. You're heading south now toward the Negev, where David's story takes on the rough geometry of rebellion and refuge. The bus windows shimmer with mirage, and every hill looks like it's holding its breath. Somewhere between myth and geology, you can almost hear the clatter of hooves, the whisper of desert conspiracies. Here's your mainstream fact. During the late 11th to early 10th centuries BCE, the southern frontier was a liminal zone, a patchwork of small fortresses, copper mines, and caravan stations linking Canaan to Edom and Arabia. Archaeologists have uncovered fortified outposts like Khirbet and Nahas, which radiocarbon dates show as active right around David's supposed reign. These sites suggest an organized political structure, someone powerful enough to control trade and taxation along those desert arteries. Whether that someone was David, though, remains a matter of lively sand-covered debate. The road dips toward the ruins of Arid, a city rebuilt and abandoned multiple times like a stubborn idea. You walk through its gate worn smooth by centuries of sandals. Inside stand the low outlines of houses, a small temple, a fortress that overlooks the dry basin below. You can see why a fugitive king might choose this kind of country to vanish into endless sightlines, quick escape routes, and no one around to ask inconvenient questions. The heat presses against you like a living thing. You imagine David hiding in these wildernesses, the caves of Adullam or En-Gedi, surrounded by mighty men who were probably as tired, thirsty, and mosquito-bitten as you are right now. You grin to yourself somewhere in those psalms of anguish and triumph. You suspect there's an unwritten verse about bug bites. A quirky tidbit in the 1980s, Bedouin shepherds discovered an ancient inscription in the desert near Kirbet Kayafa that read Shalom Asher B'Sheol, may God bless the King of Israel. Some scholars think it references an early monarch, possibly even David. Others shrug and point out that King of Israel might have been a later addition by scribes seeking retroactive validation. Historians still argue whether such fragments record genuine history or just early fan mail. You wander to the edge of the fortress wall where the land opens into infinite beige. The silence is thick enough to taste. Down below, a wadi snakes through the rock, its dry bed etched like calligraphy. Somewhere out there, biblical texts claim David raided Amalekite camps, rescued captives, and gathered wealth that would fund his later kingship. But archaeology rarely cooperates with cinematic timing. The copper slag heaps near Timnah and Feinan show industrial-scale production, yes, but the political control behind it could just as easily belong to Edomite chiefs or Egyptian administrators. The desert doesn't care whose flag you plant. It just waits for the next story. As the day burns on, you find shade beside a collapsed wall, tracing the shadow of a lintel stone carved with faint geometric patterns. They could be decoration or tally marks from a bored guard counting down the days. You sip warm water and picture David's men doing the same, living off raids, and Faith occasionally glancing east toward Moab or south toward the Red Sea, wondering if God had GPS for fugitives. The wind picks up carrying dust that tastes metallic. You remember the scholarly debates over David's empire, whether it was truly an empire or more like a loose confederation of tribes who shared a flag only when convenient. Pottery from this period shows gradual standardization. Same clay recipes, similar shapes, which could suggest central governance. Or, as one archaeologist quipped, maybe they just shared good pottery influencers. Mainstream fact: Kirbet Kayafa's defensive walls and urban layout indicate centralized planning around 1000 BCE, possibly under a king's authority. Quirky tidbit: some of the animal bones there were pig-free, matching biblical dietary rules centuries earlier than expected. Historians still argue whether that's proof of early Israelite identity or just local taste preferences. You climb to the highest point of Arad's fortress and watch the light change. The horizon blurs, colors drain to amber and gray. You think of David's Psalms again, poems born from places like this, where the soul feels both exposed and infinite. From the ends of the earth I call to you, one says. Standing here, you get it. The ends of the earth aren't about distance. They're about desolation, the place where everything unnecessary gets burned away. You chuckle softly as a desert fox darts from one ruin to another. Even the foxes have their dens, you murmur, but kings not so much. When the sun finally slips behind the hills, you head back to the road. Night falls fast here, sharp and sudden. The desert sky ignites with stars more than you thought existed. Each one feels like a dot on a vast map you'll never finish reading. Somewhere under those same constellations, 30 centuries ago, a shepherd king might have stared upward and whispered, "How majestic is your name." Whether he was myth or monarch, it's hard to deny that someone out here once felt small enough to write something that still makes people sing. You pull your jacket tight and smile. The desert doesn't answer, but it doesn't need to. Its silence is eloquence enough. The bus groans up the slope toward Hebron engine, humming like an old chant. Morning light spills gold over terraced vineyards and gray limestone walls. You're nearing one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, a place where every stone wears a century like a shawl. Somewhere beneath these streets, the story of David as king truly begins. The Bible says he ruled from here for 7.5 years before conquering Jerusalem. Archaeology, of course, smiles politely and says, maybe. But there's no denying that Hebron's layers go deep. Canaanite, Israelite, Herodian, Crusader, Ottoman, all stacked like a lasagna of time. Mainstream fact: the site known today as Tel Rumeda has produced Iron Age pottery fortifications and domestic remains from the 10th century BCE, the general window of David's rule. Archaeologists found olive presses and store jars, evidence of organized production. That suggests a functioning local administration, possibly even a royal presence. You step through narrow alleys, the scent of baking bread and dust mingling in the air. Children chase a soccer ball past a crusader arch. A cat eyes you from a wall tail, twitching like it knows the secrets of the patriarchs. You pause outside the massive Herodian stones of the Cave of Machpelah, the tomb of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, at least according to tradition. The place hums with quiet gravity. If David ruled from Hebron, this would have been his neighborhood temple. A quirky tidbit: in 1963, an excavation just outside Hebron uncovered a small limestone plaque inscribed with a fragmentary royal name, Vid or Dod. Some scholars saw David, others shrugged and suggested Dod, meaning beloved. Still others argued it might refer to a deity, not a person. Historians still argue whether that's a coincidence or the faintest archaeological echo of David's kingship. You pass an olive tree so ancient its trunk is twisted like a sleeping dragon. Locals claim it's 3,000 years old. Probably an exaggeration, but olive roots do live absurdly long. You can almost imagine a young king sitting here tuning his harp, waiting for word from the battlefield, or maybe composing psalms between council meetings. "The Lord is my shepherd," he might have murmured, glancing toward the sheep trails below. The sunlight flares on the hills, and you begin to sense the geography of power. From Hebron, David could monitor trade routes running north and south, connecting desert caravans to the coastal plains. Control this hub, and you control the arteries of wealth. The Shepherd King was no fool. His capital wasn't just poetic, it was strategic. Still, it's the human texture that lingers. In the archaeological museum, you see clay figurines, some broken deliberately, as if smashed in a purge of idols. Maybe under David's new Yahwist reforms. Maybe under some later zealot's broom. You picture an artisan watching his own creation shattered for purity's sake, and you whisper, "Sorry, buddy, wrong century." Outside, the wind picks up brushing dust over your shoes. You stop beside a well, the same kind of stone-ringed cistern that dots every hill here. The bucket creaks as it drops, and when it comes up, the water gleams dark and cold. There's a story about David once longing for a drink from Bethlehem's well, back when it was under Philistine control. 3 warriors slipped through enemy lines just to bring him a sip. Standing here, you feel that longing, a thirst that's not really about water at all, but about home memory and the ache of everything that slips away once you become a legend. You taste the air, metallic, faintly sweet. The olive presses you saw earlier, their grooves cut deep into limestone, still smell of fruit. Oil was currency then, trade and tribute, and temple offering all at once. Every press, every jar was a tax receipt, proof of authority. You realize that archaeology's language, pottery typology, residue analysis is really the ghost grammar of administration. David's reign, if real, must have left signatures like these, even if the ink has long since faded. Mainstream fact: administrative seal impressions bearing the Hebrew word Lamelech, belonging to the king, have been found across Judah, dating slightly after David, but likely continuing his bureaucratic model. Quirky tidbit: one seal impression from the region depicts a 2-winged sun disk, an Egyptian motif used by several Israelite kings, suggesting that even God's chosen monarchs occasionally borrowed branding ideas from the neighbors. Historians still argue whether that symbol was religious syncretism or just ancient graphic design. You wander uphill until the houses thin out, replaced by silent terraces. From here, Hebron looks timeless: stone boxes stacked against the slope, olive trees spilling down the valley and far beyond the shimmer of the Negev. You sit on a low wall, the stones warm under your palms. Maybe this was how it looked in David's time, minus the satellite dishes and cell towers. You close your eyes, and for a moment the hum of traffic fades into the rustle of goats and wind. You can almost hear the faint pluck of harp strings, a rhythm that feels older than speech. Maybe that's what the archaeologists are really chasing, not proof, but resonance. The echo that says someone once stood here believing they could hold the world together for just a heartbeat longer. You open your eyes, watching the light slip toward amber. Hebron glows like a memory trying not to fade. Dusk falls over Jerusalem like the slow closing of an eyelid. You're back where this long wandering began, though now the city feels different. The air hums with the voices of 3,000 years. Car horns mix with the murmur of prayers, and every street corner sits on someone's sacred dream. Beneath your feet, under these layers of pavement and pilgrimage, lies the final piece, or maybe the final absence of the David story. You make your way up toward the City of David excavations, the ridge just south of the Temple Mount. The stones are pale and pitted, carved by time and curiosity. Tour guides point out the stepped structure, a massive stone terrace, rising like the spine of an ancient ziggurat. Archaeologists call it the Milo. The Bible says David fortified it. The timing fits more or less, but as always, more or less is archaeology's favorite phrase. Mainstream fact carbon dating of the Milo's foundation and nearby structures suggests construction between the 11th and 10th centuries BCE, the rough horizon of David's reign. Pottery found there matches early iron to layers, signaling organized urban life. Quirky tidbit: when the site was first excavated in the 1920s, workers thought the terrace might be a Canaanite acropolis or even a collapsed city wall. It took decades of argument to settle on the current interpretation, and even now, historians still argue whether it's a palace, a fortress, or just a really over-engineered retaining wall. You descend through the narrow tunnels of the Gihon spring system, where water once flowed to sustain the city's first inhabitants. It's damp, cool, echoing a labyrinth of dripping shadows. Some scholars think David's forces entered Jerusalem through this same shaft, slipping under Jebusite defenses to seize the stronghold. You grin. The world's first sewer-level boss fight, you whisper voice bouncing off wet stone. Emerging into twilight, you climb toward the viewpoint that overlooks the Kidron Valley. Below, olive trees ripple like gray fire, and the lights of East Jerusalem begin to twinkle. Somewhere down there lies the so-called large stone structure, which a few brave archaeologists, especially Eilat Mazar, identified as the remains of David's palace. Huge walls, fine pottery, imported luxury goods. It sounds convincing until skeptics point out that similar finds appear in other 10th century cities. Maybe it's David's. Maybe it's someone richer. Maybe it's no one at all. Historians still argue whether the absence of unambiguous Davidic evidence means his kingdom never existed, or whether time and successive construction simply buried it too deep to reach. After all, Herod, Rome, Byzantium, the Caliphates, Crusaders, Ottomans, they all built atop him. You think about how cities are like palimpsests, each era scraping the last, but never quite erasing it. You wander higher toward the overlook near Mount Zion. The night air cools thick with spice smoke and bus exhaust. Someone's radio drifts faintly from an open window, a song in Hebrew about longing and homecoming. Fitting, you think. Mainstream fact: the Tel Dan stele, discovered in northern Israel in 1993, bears the earliest extra-biblical reference to the House of David. Carved by an Aramean king around 840 EOS BCE, it boasts of defeating the king of Israel and the king of the House of David. That phrase alone rocked biblical archaeology. Finally, a historical anchor in a sea of skepticism. Quirky tidbit: the stele had been recycled into a later wall, its inscription facing inward, until a modern bulldozer exposed it. You can't help but laugh. Sometimes history's most sacred clues turn up as building rubble. Standing at the overlook, you picture that stele, broken, half-forgotten, yet carrying the weight of an entire debate. It's not a psalm or a prophecy. It's just bureaucratic bragging the kind ancient kings specialized in. But it's enough to suggest that yes, there really was a House of David, a dynasty remembered by enemies as much as by worshippers. You look east toward the Mount of Olives, where dawn will rise soon over the Dead Sea. Somewhere under your shoes, beneath millennia of conquest and renovation, the first Jerusalem still waits unseen, unphotographed, but not entirely lost. Maybe archaeology's job isn't to prove faith, but to give it texture dirt under the nails' fingerprints on the stones. The city glows now, a constellation of lights stitched into the dark. You breathe it in slowly, feeling that odd blend of exhaustion and wonder. Every shovel of soil you've traced in your mind tonight, every shard, every debated wall, wasn't really about proving a legend. It was about listening to the earth's quiet memory. You close your eyes, the fan hum in your room, merging with the imagined wind through olive branches. The story feels full now, even if the evidence doesn't. The night exhales soft and endless. You let the noise of the city fade until only a pulse of cicadas and distant bells remain. Your body feels heavier now, melting into the mattress, the way a stone settles deeper into soil with every century. Think of all the layers we've walked through: dust and bone, fortress and faith. The arguments of scholars, the songs of shepherds, the shimmer of lamps in hidden caves. None of it certain yet, all of it alive. Maybe that's the secret gift of biblical archaeology. Not proof, but presence. The sense that somewhere between myth and sediment, truth still breathes. You picture the Judean hills under moonlight, silent, silver patient. Somewhere out there, a sling stone still lies where it fell. A harpstring, long vanished, once hummed against the same wind that now rattles dry grass. And you, across 3 millennia, are part of that continuity, the listener at the far end of the song. Let that thought settle like dust on your eyelids. You've wandered from the shepherd's fields to the palace ruins, from the desert's edge to the crowded streets of Jerusalem. Every sound, every scent, every grain of sand has carried you closer to something both ancient and familiar. So breathe in one last time. The stones are quiet now. The arguments can wait until morning. Sleep, traveler. The king's story will keep.